They said an Alpha King's choice was law. They said his claim was a bond that could never be broken. They said a low-ranked she-wolf chosen by the king should fall to her knees in gratitude. But they didn't know me. They didn't know that all I'd ever wanted was to be free. The king's gilded cage was still a cage, and I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees, even for him. And here's what they didn't know about him. His obsession was not a gift. It was a brand. And he was about to learn that some things, once broken, could never be truly owned. Stay with us until the end to see how this story unfolds. The clatter of pots was my world's heartbeat. It was a frantic, punishing rhythm that echoed the frantic, punishing beat of my own heart whenever the royal guards marched past the kitchens. Steam was my sky, a perpetual gray cloud that smelled of simmering stock and singed onions. My hands, perpetually raw and chapped, knew the slick skin of a plucked fowl better than they knew the touch of another's hand. This was my life, an omega, a ghost in the machine that served the Black Moon Pack, serving its king, Alpha Kaelen. I was nobody. Lyra, the kitchen girl. A name whispered only when a pot needed scrubbing or a floor needed mopping. My parents were gone, lost to a border skirmish when I was a pup, leaving me with nothing but a faint scent memory and the pack's grudging charity. I was a loose thread in the grand tapestry of the pack, and my only dream was to be snipped free. Every copper coin I earned, I tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath my cot. It was a small hoard, a dragon's treasure of desperation. Enough, almost, to buy passage on a merchant's cart, to disappear into the human lands where the words Alpha and Omega were just letters in an alphabet. Today, the palace hummed with an anxiety that seeped even through the thick stone walls of the kitchens. The presentation was upon us, a grotesque parade of the highest-born, most ambitious she-wolves in the kingdom, all vying to be chosen as Kaelen's Luna. The air upstairs would be thick with cloying perfumes and sharper notes of jealousy. Down here, it was just thick with grease. Lyra, more wine for the upper hall. Alara, the head cook, bellowed, her voice a saw cutting through the noise. She was a broad, sturdy beta whose kindness was buried under layers of stress. And try not to look like a kicked cur while you're doing it. The king sees everything. I flinched, pulling my threadbare shawl tighter around my shoulders. The king, Alpha Kaelen. I had seen him only in glimpses, a flash of midnight black hair, the severe line of his shoulders in a formal tunic, the chilling stillness he projected. He was a legend, a nightmare, a god. He'd taken the throne 5 years ago after his father's sudden death, and had ruled with an iron fist and a heart just as cold as they said he hadn't smiled once in all those years. They said his wolf was a beast of pure shadow and rage. I balanced the heavy silver tray, the crystal decanter sloshing with ruby red wine. My goal was simple. Get in, deposit the wine on the sideboard, and get out. Be invisible. It was a skill I had perfected over a decade of servitude. The transition from the kitchens to the upper halls was always jarring. I left the hot, humid chaos and entered a world of cool marble, gilded ceilings, and unnerving quiet. The silence here was heavier than any noise. It was filled with unspoken threats and judgments. My worn leather slippers made no sound on the polished floors as I slipped along the edge of the great hall. The room was a kaleidoscope of color and power. Alphas and betas in their finest silks and velvets stood in tense, whispering clusters. And on the dais at the far end of the room sat the king. He was exactly as the stories painted him, and yet so much more terrifying in person. He wasn't a large man, but the power rolling off him was a physical force, pressing down on the very air in the room. His black hair was pushed back from a face that looked carved from granite, all sharp angles and unyielding lines. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the procession of she-wolves being presented to him. His expression was one of profound, utter boredom. One by one, they approached. Lady Annalise of the Silver Creek Pack, her blonde hair spun into an elaborate crown. Lady Isolde from the east, her red dress a slash of defiance. Each performed a deep, graceful curtsy. Each offered a practiced, demure smile. Kaelen watched them with the detached interest of a man inspecting livestock. He gave a curt nod, a flick of his fingers in dismissal, and the next candidate would step forward. My heart hammered against my ribs. I just needed to reach the sideboard, a long mahogany table against the far wall. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the rug. Be a mouse. Be a shadow. Don't exist. I was almost there when a sharp gasp cut through the hall. I risked a glance up. Lady Seraphina was before the king. Daughter of his foremost general, Lord Valerius, she was the odds-on favorite. She was stunning, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of emeralds. Her confidence was a cloak she wore as easily as the silk dress that shimmered around her. She didn't just curtsy. She flowed, a river of grace and power. Alpha King, she murmured, her voice like honeyed velvet. Kaelen's eyes, which had been glazed over, sharpened for a fraction of a second. He looked at her, truly looked, and a collective breath was held throughout the hall. This was it, the moment of choosing. And then his gaze drifted. Past Seraphina, over the heads of the assembled lords and ladies. His eyes swept the room with an unnerving intensity, and for one horrifying, stomach-dropping second, they locked with mine. Everything stopped. The air crystallized. The whispers died. It was as if a spell had been cast, and I was the focal point. His eyes weren't just looking at me, they were dissecting me. I saw a flicker of something in their gray depths, surprise, confusion, and then a terrifying, predatory focus. It felt like a physical touch, a cold hand closing around my soul. My training, my decade of practice in being invisible, evaporated. My blood turned to ice. My breath hitched. The heavy tray in my hands trembled. One of the crystal decanters, slick with condensation, slipped from its perfect alignment. I fumbled, my clumsy fingers trying to correct it, but it was too late. It tilted, overbalanced, and fell. The crash was obscene in the sudden silence. Crystal shattered against marble. Red wine, the color of blood, splattered across the pristine floor, soaking into the edge of a priceless antique rug. A collective gasp, sharp and judgmental, echoed through the hall. Mortification burned through me, hotter than any kitchen fire. I dropped to my knees, my hands hovering uselessly over the glittering shards and the spreading crimson stain. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words swallowed by the cavernous space. "I'm so sorry, Alpha. Please." I didn't dare look at him, but I could feel his gaze. It was a weight, a physical pressure on the back of my neck. I could hear Seraphina's delicate, triumphant sniff of disgust. I was less than dirt, a clumsy omega who had ruined this sacred moment. The punishment would be severe. A week in the cells, maybe. A public whipping. Or worse, dismissal. To be cast out with no pack was a death sentence, and my escape fund was still so pitifully small. "Get up." The voice was low, rough, and vibrated through the floorboards directly into my bones. It was him. It was the king. Slowly, shaking, I lifted my head. He was no longer on the dais. He was standing not 10 feet from me, having moved with the impossible silence of a predator. His face was a mask of cold fury, or so I thought. But as my terrified eyes met his, I saw it wasn't fury. It was something else, something I couldn't name, an unnerving, raw intensity. "What is your name?" he demanded. The entire court was frozen, watching this bizarre, unprecedented interaction. "Lyra Alpha," I stammered, my voice barely a squeak. He took a step closer. The scent of him washed over me, pine and winter frost, and something else, something uniquely his, something that made the wolf inside me, a creature I barely knew I possessed, stir in a confusing mix of terror and recognition. "Lyra," he repeated, the name sounding strange and foreign on his tongue. He looked from my face down to the mess on the floor, then back up. His eyes narrowed. "You are not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and it was wrong. I was terrified. I was more scared than I'd ever been in my life. But in that moment, another feeling warred with the fear. It was the raw, primal desperation of a cornered animal. My dream of freedom, the only thing that kept me going, was about to be extinguished because of a spilled drink. And a spark of defiance, hot and reckless, flared in the face of my terror. "Should I be?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. They were quiet, but in the dead silence of the hall, they rang out like a bell. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The crowd shifted, murmuring in shock. Seraphina's beautiful face was a mask of incandescent rage. How dare I? How dare a nothing, a nobody speak to the king with anything but groveling deference? Kaelen's lips, which I had never seen move in anything but a grim line, tilted in something that was not quite a smile. It was something sharper, more dangerous. "Perhaps." He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the high-born ladies, lingering for a moment on Seraphina's furious one, and then he looked back at me, kneeling in a puddle of wine and shattered glass. He did the impossible. He did the unthinkable. "The presentation is over," he declared, his voice booming with absolute authority. "I have made my choice." He extended a hand, not to Seraphina, not to any of the ladies, to me. The world tilted on its axis. A roaring sound filled my ears. I stared at his hand, long-fingered and powerful, hanging in the air before me. This was a mistake, a cruel joke. He couldn't possibly mean... "Well," he prompted, a note of impatience in his voice. "Are you going to stay on the floor all day?" My mind was a blank slate of panic. This wasn't happening. I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to be saving coppers to run away. I wasn't supposed to be chosen by the terrifying Alpha King in front of the entire kingdom. This wasn't an honor. It was a death sentence of a different kind. Slowly, as if in a dream, I placed my trembling, wine-stained hand into his. His grip was firm, his skin surprisingly warm. He pulled me to my feet with an effortless strength. And then, holding my hand as if I were a queen and not a kitchen servant, he turned to the stunned court. "Behold," Alpha King Kaelen announced, his voice ringing with finality, his stormy eyes never leaving my face. "Your Luna." Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. This was wrong. All wrong. I tried to pull my hand back, a desperate, futile gesture. "No," I whispered, the sound lost in the uproar that finally erupted from the crowd. "Please, no." His grip tightened, not painfully, but inexorably. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, his warm breath a shocking intimacy against my skin. "It is done," he murmured, his voice a low growl meant only for me. "You are mine." The world I knew, the simple, miserable world of clattering pots and dreams of escape, had just ended. I had been invisible my whole life, and now I was the most terrifyingly visible person in the entire kingdom. I hadn't been chosen. I had been claimed. And as I stood there, trapped in the king's grip, I looked out at the sea of enraged and jealous faces and realized my life was no longer my own. The gilded cage had just slammed shut. The hours that followed were a blur of shocked faces and frantic activity. I was ripped from my life as if by a tornado. One moment I was in my servant's tunic, smelling of spilled wine and fear. The next I was surrounded by a swarm of fluttering, panicking beta handmaidens who seemed just as horrified as I was. They stripped me of my rough clothes, scrubbed me raw in a tub of scented water, and forced me into a gown of pale blue silk that felt alien and suffocating against my skin. They didn't speak to me, only about me, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. "And Omega, can you believe it? Her hands, they're red raw." What was the king thinking? Lady Seraphina is going to lose her mind. I was a doll, a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for. They poked, prodded, and pulled, tutting at my calloused hands and the single, clumsy braid I usually wore. My hair was unceremoniously undone, brushed until my scalp tingled, and then twisted into a soft, intricate style that made the stranger in the mirror look even less like me. This stranger had my gray eyes, but hers were wide, with a haunted, hunted look. This stranger wore silk, but she looked as comfortable as a wolf in a snare. This stranger was the chosen Luna of the Black Moon Pack. And she was going to be sick. Finally, they were done. They led me, silent and trembling, through a labyrinth of corridors I had only ever glimpsed from a distance. We didn't go to the guest wing. We didn't go to the ladies' apartments. We went to the king's wing. My heart hammered, a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of doom. The guards at his door, massive alphas who had never once acknowledged my existence, now bowed their heads as I passed. The gesture was so foreign, so wrong, that I nearly stumbled. One of the handmaidens, a stern-faced woman named Helga, opened a heavy oak door. "The king awaits you," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She practically pushed me inside and then shut the door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. The room was vast and masculine. A huge hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows on the dark wood paneling and shelves packed with books. A massive bed, draped in black furs, sat on a raised platform like an altar. The air still carried his scent, pine and winter frost, but it was stronger here, so potent it was almost dizzying. And there he was. He stood by the tall, arched windows, his back to me, staring out at the moonlit grounds. He had shed his formal tunic for a simple black shirt that clung to the powerful lines of his back and shoulders. For a long moment, he didn't speak or turn around. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. I stood frozen by the door, my hands clenched in the folds of the suffocating silk dress. My mind raced. This had to be a mistake, a test. Maybe if I just explained, begged him, told him I wanted nothing from him, he would let me go. "I don't want this," I blurted out, the words raw and desperate. He turned slowly. His face in the firelight was all shadows and sharp planes. His stormy eyes pinned me in place. "What you want is irrelevant." "But why?" My voice trembled. but I forced myself to stand my ground. There were dozens of others. Highborn ladies, alphas, Lady Seraphina. She's perfect. She's strong. She's respected. I'm nothing. I'm an omega, a kitchen maid. I am aware of what you are, he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He took a step toward me, and I took an involuntary step back, my back hitting the solid wood of the door. Trapped. Then you must know I'm not fit to be your Luna, I pleaded. I don't know the first thing about court. I don't have any political training. I'll be a disgrace to you. I was trying to reason with him, to show him how illogical his choice was. He kept coming, his steps silent and deliberate, a predator closing in. You think I chose my Luna based on her ability to host a banquet? He scoffed, a dark amusement flickering in his eyes. Then why? I asked again, my voice barely a whisper. Why me? He was in front of me now, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was taller than I'd realized. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He lifted a hand, and I flinched, my eyes squeezing shut, expecting a blow. I had been cuffed by angry betas for lesser offenses than speaking to the king this way. But he didn't strike me. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from my cheek. The unexpected touch was like a brand, searing my skin. My eyes flew open. Because when I looked at you, he said, his voice dropping to an intense, intimate murmur, you were the only one who wasn't trying to sell me something. Every other she-wolf in that room looked at me and saw a crown, a title, power. They looked at the throne. You, he paused, his thumb stroking my jawline, sending a shiver of pure terror through me. You looked at me. I was scared, I insisted, trying to twist my head away from his touch, but he held my chin firmly. No, he contradicted softly. Not just scared. I saw you. In that moment before the decanter fell, you looked at me, and you were not impressed. You were not awed. You were annoyed. A ghost of that sharp, dangerous smile touched his lips again. No one has looked at me like that in a very long time. It was refreshing. This was insane. He had upended my entire life, destroyed my only dream because he found my terror refreshing. The spark of defiance from the hall roared into a flame, So, this is a game to you? I spat, my voice shaking with rage. You ruin my life for your own amusement? You trap me here because you were bored? His eyes darkened, the amusement vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. His grip on my chin tightened slightly, a reminder of his immense strength. Do not mistake my interest for weakness. You are here because I chose you. You are mine now, Lyra. The sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be. I will never accept it, I vowed, my voice low and fierce. I will never be yours. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a primal sound of possession and warning. You already are. The claim has been made. The bond is already forming between us. Can you not feel it? And to my horror, I could. It was a faint thrumming under my skin, a pull in my gut toward him, an echo of his powerful aura inside my own. It was terrifying, an invasion of my very being. I don't want it, I said, tears of fury and despair blurring my vision. Take it back. I cannot, he said simply, and I would not. This is your new reality. These are your chambers. He gestured to an adjoining door. The handmaidens will see to your needs. You will be tutored. You will learn what is required of you, and you will not attempt to leave. His voice dropped, losing its conversational tone and becoming the chilling command of a king. If you try to run, I will find you, and your life will become significantly more difficult than it is now. Do you understand me?" I stared at him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. He wasn't just a king. He was a tyrant, a jailer, and I was his newest, most prized prisoner. I didn't answer. I just glared at him, pouring all of my hatred, my fear, and my defiance into that single look. He held my gaze for a long moment, then released my chin with a suddenness that made me stumble. "Good," he said, as if I had agreed. "Now go. I have work to do." He turned his back on me, dismissing me as easily as he had the high-born ladies earlier. He walked over to a large desk littered with maps and scrolls, the audience over. Shaking with a mixture of rage and terror, I stumbled toward the door he had indicated. It opened into a bedroom that was larger and more luxurious than any room I'd ever been in. A soft bed with clean linens, a wardrobe full of clothes in my size, a private bathing chamber. It was a princess's boudoir. It was the most beautiful prison I had ever seen. I slammed the door shut, the sound barely making a dent in the oppressive silence of the king's wing. I leaned against it, my body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. My dream of freedom was gone. My little hoard of coins under the floorboard seemed like a joke from another lifetime. I was trapped, claimed by a monster who thought my soul was a toy. But as I sank to the floor, a new, hard resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. He thought he had won. He thought because he was king, he could take whatever he wanted. He thought he could break me. He was wrong. I would learn. I would learn the rules of this gilded cage. I would learn the politics and the etiquette he wanted me to know. But not for him. I would do it for me. I would find a weakness in the bars. I would find a way to escape. He may have claimed my body, but he would never, ever own my spirit. My war had just begun. The next morning, my new life began in earnest. I was woken not by the familiar clang of the cook's ladle on a pot, but by a soft knock on my chamber door. Helga, the stern beta handmaiden, entered with 2 younger maids in tow. They carried trays of food I couldn't identify and laid out another silk dress, this one the color of cream. "You are to breakfast with the king," Helga announced, her face set in lines of disapproval. The thought of facing him again made my stomach churn. "I'm not hungry." "It was not a request," she said flatly. "It is a command. You will dress, and you will present yourself in the king's solar in 15 minutes. There was no arguing. I was a prisoner, and she was one of my guards. I allowed them to dress me, my body rigid with resistance. Every soft brush of their hands felt like a violation. The dress was beautiful, but it felt like a costume for a role I refused to play. Walking to his solar was a new kind of torture. The palace staff, the guards and servants who had been my peers only yesterday, now averted their eyes as I passed. Some bowed their heads stiffly. I could feel their resentment, their confusion. I was an imposter, a cuckoo in the royal nest. Kaelen was seated at the head of a long table laden with food. He was already engrossed in a scroll, and he didn't look up when I entered. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair on his right. I sat on the very edge of the plush velvet seat, my back ramrod straight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the scratch of his quill on parchment. A servant poured me juice into a crystal goblet. My hands were shaking so much I didn't dare pick it up. "Eat," he said, still not looking at me. I stared at the plate of food before me. Fluffy eggs, smoked fish, sweet pastries. It was more food than I sometimes saw in a week, and I couldn't swallow a single bite. The knot of anxiety in my stomach was too tight. "I told you I'm not hungry," I said, my voice tight. This time, he did look up. His gray eyes were cold and impatient. This is not the kitchen, Lyra. You are not a servant who can skip a meal because she is in a mood. You are to be the Luna. You will sit at my table, and you will eat. You will project an image of contentment and strength, even if you do not feel it. Your weakness reflects on me. His words were like a slap. My weakness, my terror and misery were an inconvenience, an embarrassment to him. The anger from the night before surged back, hot and clarifying. Fine. If he wanted a performance, I would give him one. I picked up a silver fork, the weight of it unfamiliar in my hand. With deliberate, measured movements, I began to eat. I forced down the eggs, my throat tight. I took a bite of the pastry, the sweetness cloying. I did it all with a placid expression on my face, my eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. He watched me for a moment, a flicker of something. Surprise? Approval? In his eyes. Then he returned to his scroll. After your meal, your tutors will arrive. Lady Honora for etiquette and history. Lord Boleyn for politics and law. Tutors? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. You yourself pointed out your deficiencies, he said without looking up. They will be corrected. I will not have a Luna who is an ignorant savage. You will apply yourself. You will learn. And if I refuse? I challenged softly. He finally set down his quill and gave me his full attention. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. Refuse? You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in any of this. Let me be clear. You can learn these things the easy way, with tutors and books in a comfortable chamber, or you can learn them the hard way. Do not test me, Lyra. You will not like the consequences. The threat hung in the air between us, as sharp and real as a drawn blade. I held his gaze, my chin lifted. I would not cower. I would not beg. Would. I understand, I said, my voice cold. A strange look passed over his face, a flash of frustration mixed with something else. It was as if he expected me to fight, to scream, to cry. My cold compliance seemed to unnerve him more than my defiance. Good, he said, his voice clipped. See that you do. The rest of the day was a special kind of hell. Lady Honora was a pinched-face elder who looked at me as if I were something she'd scraped off her shoe. She spent hours drilling me on the proper way to walk, to sit, to curtsy to a visiting alpha, to address a beta servant. My every move was clumsy, my every word uncultured. No, 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 she'd snap, rapping my knuckles with a wooden ruler. A Luna does not stomp like a pack horse. You glide, your back straight, chin up. Do you want the entire kingdom to think the king married a barbarian? Lord Boleyn was worse. He was a dry, condescending man who spoke of treaties and bloodlines as if I were a particularly dull-witted child. He'd ask me questions about the history of the Eastern Pax or the trade agreements with the human cities, and my blank stares would be met with sighs of exasperation. The Luna is the heart of the pack, its soul, he droned. She must be a diplomat, a strategist, a symbol. You, child, are a blank page, a rather smudged one at that. By evening, my head was pounding and my body ached. I felt smaller and more stupid than I ever had scrubbing pots in the kitchen. This was their strategy, I realized, to break me down, to strip away every piece of who I was and rebuild me into something of their own making. That night, I was escorted to the formal dining hall. It was a smaller affair than the breakfast. Just Kaelen, myself, and his most trusted general, Lord Valerius, Seraphina's father. Lord Valerius was a mountain of a man with a stern face and eyes the color of chips of ice. He made no secret of his disdain. He barely acknowledged my presence, directing all of his conversation to Kaelen, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and calculating. Then, halfway through the meal, the doors opened and Seraphina swept in. She was a vision in emerald green, her golden hair gleaming in the candlelight. She ignored me completely, rushing to her father's side and then turning a brilliant, dazzling smile on the king. "Kaelen," she said, her voice a sultry purr. "Forgive my intrusion. I was just so worried. After the events of yesterday, I wanted to make sure you were well." "I am perfectly well, Seraphina," Kaelen said, his voice flat. He did not invite her to sit. She pouted prettily, her eyes flicking to me for a brief, venomous second before returning to the king. "Of course you are. You are always strong. I know the burdens of the crown are heavy, and making such a surprising choice must have been draining." Her words were honey-sweet, but the poison underneath was potent. She was questioning his judgment, reminding him of my unsuitability, all under the guise of concern. "My choice was not draining. It was decisive," Kaelen countered, his eyes narrowing slightly. Lord Valerius cleared his throat. "My daughter means only to offer her support, Your Majesty, as a loyal friend. She understands the complexities of leadership, the need for strong alliances." He looked pointedly at me. "Something your new choice may not yet grasp." It was a coordinated attack, father and daughter working in concert to undermine me. I felt a familiar wave of panic, the urge to shrink, to disappear. I stared down at my plate, my hands clenched in my lap. "She will learn," Kaelen said, a note of finality in his tone. Seraphina laughed, a light, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, I'm sure she's a very fast learner. Aren't you, little mouse?" She finally addressed me directly, her voice dripping with condescension. "You must tell me, what is it like? To go from scrubbing floors to sitting at the king's table in a single day? It must be quite the fairy tale." My head snapped up. The anger, which had been simmering all day, finally boiled over. The lessons from Lady Honora, the condescension of Lord Boleyn, the crushing weight of Kaelen's ownership, it all coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. I met Seraphina's mocking gaze. I gave her a small, cool smile, a trick I'd seen highborn ladies use on each other. "It is educational, Lady Seraphina," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "For instance, I'm learning that the quality of the silk on your back has very little to do with the quality of the character underneath it." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Valerius looked thunderstruck. Seraphina's jaw dropped, her perfect mask of concern shattering to reveal the raw fury beneath. Even Kaelen looked startled, his head turning to me with a new, sharp interest. Seraphina recovered first. A flush crept up her neck, staining her pale skin. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low and shaking with rage. "I dare, because I am here," I replied, my own boldness surprising me. "And you are not." I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor. I stood and gave a flawless, if slightly stiff curtsy to the king, just as Lady Honora had drilled into me for hours. "If you will excuse me, Alpha, the day has been long. I am weary." Without waiting for his permission, I turned and walked out of the dining hall. I didn't run. I glided, just as Honora had instructed. Back straight, chin up. I could feel their 3 sets of eyes burning into my back. I didn't stop walking until I was back in the safety of my gilded cage. I closed the door, my heart hammering, my body trembling with adrenaline. I had done it. I had fought back. It was a small victory, a single verbal barb against a sea of enemies, but it was mine. A strange, hysterical laugh escaped my lips. They thought they could mold me into a silent, obedient doll. They had no idea what they had just awoken. I had spent my life learning to be invisible, to survive by being unnoticed. But now, they had forced me into the light, and I was discovering that a cornered wolf, no matter how small, still has teeth. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I'd just won a battle. The days that followed settled into a grueling routine. Mornings were for a tense, mostly silent breakfast with Kaelen. The afternoons were a torturous rotation of tutors. Lady Honora continued her campaign to sand down my rough edges, while Lord Balin tried to pour a kingdom's worth of knowledge into my supposedly empty head. I endured it. I absorbed everything, my anger a fire that fueled a desperate need to learn. They wanted to make me their puppet. I would learn to pull the strings myself. My small act of defiance against Seraphina had consequences. She no longer bothered with veiled insults. Her hostility was now open and constant. She and her coterie of high-born sycophants would accidentally cross my path in the corridors. "Look, it's the kitchen queen," one of them, a vapid girl named Livia, would titter. "Careful your dress doesn't get stained with grease," another would add. Seraphina would just watch, a smug, cruel smile on her face. Give her time, ladies. One cannot expect a stray to learn house manners overnight. I learned to ignore them, to walk past with my head held high, their words like water off a duck's back. But it was isolating. I had no friends, no allies. The servants who were once my companions now feared being associated with me. I was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of enemies. And Kaelen was an enigma. He watched me constantly. During our meals, I would feel his gaze on me, analytical and intense. He never offered a word of comfort or defense. When I mentioned the torment from Seraphina and her friends, his response was cold and dismissive. "You are to be Luna," he'd said, his eyes not leaving the report he was reading. "Do you expect me to fight your battles for you? A weak Luna makes for a weak pack. If you cannot handle a few jealous girls, how will you handle a rival alpha trying to take my throne?" His words stung, but they also hardened my resolve. He would not help me. I could expect no quarter from him. Fine. I would learn to be strong on my own. My only respite was the royal library. Lord Balin, in his infinite condescension, had granted me access, remarking that perhaps some knowledge might seep in through proximity. It was a vast, circular room, tiers of books stretching up to a domed ceiling. It was quiet. It smelled of old paper and leather, and more importantly, it was usually empty. Here, I wasn't the clumsy Omega or the imposter Luna. I was just Lyra. I devoured books on history, on law, on the folklore of the Outer Territories. I was arming myself. Knowledge was a weapon, and I intended to be an arsenal. It was in the library late one afternoon that I met him. I was perched on a ladder, reaching for a heavy tome on the lineage of the ancient Lunas, when I heard a soft cough behind me. I startled, nearly losing my footing. A hand shot out to steady the ladder. "Apologies," a calm voice said. "I did not mean to frighten you." I looked down. A man stood at the base of the ladder, his hand still resting on the wood. He was tall and slender, with kind eyes and hair the color of sand. He wore the simple robes of a scholar or a scribe. He wasn't a broad, intimidating alpha, nor a bustling beta. There was a quiet stillness about him. It's fine," I stammered, clutching the book to my chest as I climbed down. "You are the Lady Lyra," he said. It wasn't a question. He bowed his head slightly. My name is Elias. I am the keeper of the archives. The king's choice, I corrected him, my voice bitter. Not a lady. A flicker of sympathy crossed his face. A title is just a word. It is the person who gives it meaning. He glanced at the book in my hands. The Annals of the First Queens. A heavy choice, in more ways than one. Lord Boleyn insists I study our history, I said, unable to keep the resentment from my voice. Balin sees history as a list of names and dates, Elias said with a faint, wry smile. He misses the stories. The truth is always in the stories, not the lists. He gestured to a small, secluded reading nook. May I? I was hesitant. Talking to anyone was a risk. But there was a gentleness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in anyone since I'd left the kitchens. I nodded. For the next hour, we talked. He didn't ask me about the king or the court. He asked me about the books I was reading. He spoke of the ancient Lunas not as political figures, but as women. He told me of Luna Ilera, who could calm raging alphas with a single touch, and Luna Rhiannon, whose connection to the earth was so strong they said she could make flowers bloom in winter. These were stories the pack has forgotten, he said, his voice soft. We remember the wars and the treaties, but we forget the magic. We've been ruled by alphas for so long, we've forgotten that the truest, most stable power comes from balance. The alpha's strength and the luna's grace. The sun and the moon. It was the first real conversation I'd had in weeks. For a brief time, I forgot I was a prisoner. I was just a student learning from a kind teacher. My lessons with Elias became a secret routine. Every afternoon, I would escape to the library, and he would be there. He guided my reading, pointing me toward dusty, forgotten scrolls and books that weren't on Lord Boleyn's approved list. These books spoke of a different kind of power. Not the brute force of an alpha, but something quieter, more innate. They spoke of empaths, of healers, of seers, abilities once common in powerful Omega and Luna lines, but now dismissed as myth. They feared it, Elias explained one day, his fingers tracing the faded illustration of a wolf with silver eyes. Alphas who ruled by fear could not comprehend a power based on connection, so they suppressed it, called it witchcraft, wrote it out of the history books. Something stirred within me as I read these texts. A strange sense of recognition, like a half-remembered dream. I thought of the way I could always sense the mood in the kitchens before I even entered. The way a brewing fight between two scullery maids would make my stomach clench. I thought of the way I could calm the baker's perpetually angry dog with just a soft word. I'd always dismissed it as being overly sensitive. Elias, I asked hesitantly one afternoon, these abilities, are they real? He looked at me, his gaze deep and knowing. Power is always real, Lyra. It simply sleeps until it is called. He reached into the sleeve of his robe and pulled out a small, flat stone, polished smooth and cool to the touch. It was milky white, with a faint, shimmering core. This is a moonstone. They were once used by Lunas to focus their inner energy. Hold it. I took the stone. The moment my skin touched its surface, a jolt went through me, like a spark of static electricity. The stone warmed in my palm, and the shimmering core seemed to pulse with a soft, silver light that only I could see. The quiet thrumming I sometimes felt. The bond with Kaelen suddenly sharpened, and for a split second, I felt a wave of frustration, annoyance. Not my own. It was distant, but clear. I gasped and dropped the stone as if it had burned me. It clattered on the table, its light fading. What was that? I whispered. my heart racing. That, Elias said, his voice full of a quiet awe, was the king. You felt his emotions. I felt his frustration, I said, stunned. You have the gift, Lyra, Elias said softly. A powerful one. You are an empath. This is why he was drawn to you. Not because you looked at him, but because on some primal level, his wolf recognized what you are. Your spirit called to his. I stared at him, my mind reeling. An empath. Me. The kitchen girl. The nothing Omega. It was impossible. But how? Your bloodline, he said. Your parents. I looked them up in the archives. They were not highborn, but your mother's line. It traces back, far back, to a line of Lunas thought to be lost. A line of powerful empaths. I was not just a nobody. I had a lineage, a legacy of power I never knew existed. The world tilted on its axis for the second time in as many weeks. But this time, it wasn't fear that filled me. It was a dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating glimmer of hope. This power, it wasn't something Kaelen had given me. It wasn't something the tutors could drill into me. It was mine. It had always been mine. A new plan began to form in my mind, eclipsing the old, simple one of just running away. Escape was no longer enough. Kaelen had trapped me. Seraphina had tormented me. The court had scorned me. They thought I was weak, a plaything, a pawn. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I would not just survive this prison, I would conquer it. With Elias as my guide, I would learn to control this gift. I would turn their gilded cage into my own personal fortress. My transformation had begun, and my revenge would be a dish served not cold, but with the burning fire of a power they had long forgotten. The weeks turned into a month, then two. On the surface, I was the model pupil. I learned to glide, to offer the perfect curtsy, to debate the finer points of a trade agreement with Lord Boleyn, until even he had to grudgingly admit I was no longer entirely hopeless. I wore the silk gowns, attended the tedious banquets, and played the part of the meek, learning Luna to be. But beneath the surface, I was engaged in a secret, silent war. Every afternoon in the library with Elias was a training session. He taught me to shield my mind, to build walls of psychic silence so the turbulent emotions of others wouldn't overwhelm me. Then, he taught me to reach out. It is not about reading minds, he would explain, his voice a calm anchor in my confusion. It is about feeling the truth behind the words. Fear, ambition, deceit. They all have a unique texture. You must learn to recognize them. We started small. I would hold the moonstone and try to sense the emotions of a guard passing in the corridor outside. Boredom, mostly, with a hint of hunger. I learned to distinguish the harried anxiety of the servants from the arrogant entitlement of the court nobles. The bond with Kaelen was the most difficult. It was a roaring river of feeling compared to the trickling streams of others. His emotions were a constant, powerful presence at the edge of my consciousness. Most often, I felt his iron control, a banked frustration, a deep-seated loneliness that was so profound it felt like a cavern in his soul. It was unsettling. It made him almost human. I pushed that thought away. He was my jailer, not a man to be pitied. I learned to use his own power against him. During our silent breakfasts, I would subtly reach out. When he was reviewing a report from a general, I could feel his skepticism, the sense that he was being lied to. When a trade minister proposed a new tariff, I could feel the greed shimmering beneath the man's polite words. One morning, Kaelen was reading a plea from a border village. They claimed a neighboring pack, the Stonefirs, were raiding their livestock, and they begged for royal intervention. "They are lying," Kaelen muttered, tossing the scroll aside. "The Stonefurs are honor-bound. They would not break the treaty." I focused, holding the image of the scroll in my mind, reaching for the emotion tied to it. I felt desperation, but beneath it, a sharp, bitter spike of fear. Not fear of the Stonefurs, fear of starvation. "They're not lying about the raids," I said quietly. Kaelen looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "And you know this how? Have you suddenly developed a mastery of border politics between pastries?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "But they aren't afraid of the Stonefurs. They're afraid of the winter. Their harvest failed. They are fabricating the raids because they are too proud to ask for aid, but they know you will send soldiers and supplies if you believe you are defending your borders." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. The air crackled with tension. I had overstepped. I had revealed too much. "How could you possibly know that?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "It's logical," I improvised, my heart hammering. Lord Boleyn spoke of the pride of the border clans. They would rather invent an enemy than admit to the weakness of a failed crop. It was a weak explanation, but it was all I had. He continued to stare at me for a long, unnerving moment. I felt a wave of suspicion from him, a sharp, probing curiosity, but then it was followed by a grudging respect. He picked up the scroll again, reading it with new eyes. "Send a scout to the village," he commanded the guard at the door, "discreetly, and send a quartermaster to assess the grain stores. Tell no one the reason." He didn't look at me again for the rest of the meal, but I had felt it. A crack in his certainty, a seed of doubt. He was starting to see me as more than just a disobedient pet. My newfound confidence began to bleed into my public life. The change was subtle at first. I no longer flinched when Serafina and her cronies approached. I met their insults with a calm, unnerving silence. One afternoon, they cornered me near the rose gardens. "Still playing dress-up, kitchen maid?" Serafina sneered, blocking my path. Her two companions, Livia and Mara, flanked her like well-dressed gargoyles. I focused, just as Elias had taught me. I pushed past Serafina's surface-level malice and felt the truth beneath it. A gnawing, desperate insecurity. She wasn't just cruel. She was terrified. Terrified that Kaelen had chosen me. Terrified of being supplanted, of being seen as second best. Her entire identity was built on being the perfect choice, and I, in my unworthiness, had shattered it. The realization was intoxicating. It stripped her of her power over me. She wasn't a magnificent predator. She was a frightened child, throwing a tantrum. "That's a lovely dress, Serafina," I said, my voice pleasant. I reached out and touched the fine silk of her sleeve. It must be difficult, always having to look so perfect. It must be exhausting to worry so much about what everyone thinks of you. I let a sliver of her own insecurity, which I could feel churning inside her, echo back in my voice. Her smile faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, pulling her arm away. "Of course not," I said softly. I then turned my attention to Livia, who was smirking behind Serafina. I focused on her. Greed. A desperate desire to marry into a higher status family. "And you, Lady Livia, I do hope your father's trade negotiations in the north are successful. It would be a shame if that dowry you're counting on were to shrink." Livia's face went pale. Her smirk vanished. Finally, I looked at Mara. Fear. Pure, simple fear. Fear of Serafina. fear of being cast out of the popular circle. "Don't worry, Mara," I said, my voice gentle. "Your secret is safe with me." I hadn't the faintest idea what secret she had, but it didn't matter. The raw panic that flashed in her eyes was proof enough that she had one. I smiled sweetly at the three of them. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have studies to attend to." I walked away, leaving them standing there in stunned, unnerved silence. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted them, but I had landed a blow far more effective than any verbal sparring. I had used their own fears against them. The grand reemergence happened at the Midwinter Gala, a massive event attended by every noble of any importance. It was my first major public appearance since the disastrous presentation. All eyes would be on me. The court was waiting for me to fail. Helga and the maids dressed me in a gown of midnight blue velvet that shimmered with tiny embroidered silver stars. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was in a costume. My hair was swept up, and around my neck, hidden beneath the high collar, I wore Elias's moonstone on a thin silver chain. It was cool and steady against my skin, a secret source of strength. Kaelen was waiting for me outside my chambers. He was dressed in formal black, a silver circlet on his brow. When he saw me, he actually stopped. For a split second, his iron control slipped, and I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated possessiveness and admiration. It was so strong it made me dizzy. "You look acceptable," he said, his voice gruff, his face betraying nothing. He held out his arm. "As do you, Your Majesty," I replied coolly, placing my hand on his arm. Walking into the ballroom on his arm was like stepping into a furnace. The heat of hundreds of eyes hit me at once. The air was thick with a cocktail of emotions: curiosity, resentment, jealousy, disdain. I shielded myself as Elias had taught me, wrapping a cloak of calm around my mind. Seraphina was there, of course, holding court in a dress of fiery red. She looked like a queen in her own right. When she saw me on Kaelen's arm, her face tightened, and I felt a wave of pure hatred, so venomous it almost breached my shields. Kaelen led me to the dais, but instead of sitting, he remained standing, his hand resting on the back of my chair. A clear signal. I was his, and I was to be respected. The night wore on. Nobles approached to offer stilted, formal greetings. I handled them with the cool grace Lady Honora had beaten into me. But I was also listening with my other sense. I felt the ambition of a young alpha trying to curry favor, the bitterness of an old lord who felt overlooked, the genuine warmth of a few of the lower-ranked betas who were simply in awe. The main event of the evening was an auction of artifacts to raise money for the city watch. The final item was a magnificent hunting bow, said to have belonged to the legendary first king. It was a symbol of power and prestige. The bidding was fierce, quickly escalating between two proud alphas. Then, Lord Valerius, Seraphina's father, entered the bidding. He clearly wanted the bow, a statement of his family's importance. The other bidders fell silent, unwilling to challenge the king's general. 1,000 gold marks, Valerius boomed. The auctioneer began his final call. 2,000, a voice said, clear and calm. Every head turned. It was me. A shocked silence fell over the ballroom. Kaelen, standing behind me, went utterly still. I felt a jolt of pure shock from him. Lord Valerius turned to look at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, which quickly curdled into fury. The Lady Lyra bids 2,000, the auctioneer stammered. I do not have a title, I corrected him calmly, but I have the funds. I had brought my escape money with me. It wasn't anywhere near 2,000 gold marks, but They didn't know that. This was a bluff, a high-stakes game of chicken. Valerius's face purpled with rage. To be outbid was an insult. To be outbid by me, the Omega kitchen maid who had stolen his daughter's rightful place, was an unforgivable public humiliation. 2,500, he growled. 3,000, I said immediately without blinking. I could feel his rage, but underneath it, I felt a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. He was a warrior, used to direct confrontation, not this kind of unpredictable social warfare. 3,500, he snarled. All eyes were on us. This was no longer about the bow. It was a public duel. I leaned back in my chair slightly, projecting an air of casual boredom. I was terrified. My heart was pounding, but my face was a mask of calm. 5,000, I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall. A collective gasp went through the room. It was an astronomical sum. Lord Valerius froze. I focused on him, sensing his inner turmoil. Rage warred with pride. He could probably afford it, but it would be a foolish waste of coin. To be goaded into paying such an obscene price by me would make him look like a fool. But to back down now would also be a humiliation. He was trapped. He stared at me, his eyes promising murder. I simply met his gaze and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. The silence stretched. Finally, with a snarl of disgust, he turned away. Let the girl have her toy, he spat. The auctioneer, looking stunned, slammed his gavel down. Sold. To Lyra. For 5,000 gold marks. A wave of shocked murmurs swept the room. I had publicly challenged and defeated the most powerful general in the kingdom. I had drawn a line in the sand. I felt Kaelen's hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight. I braced myself for his fury. I had acted without his permission, used his unspoken authority to challenge his most important general. He leaned down, his voice a low growl in my ear, meant only for me. Where, precisely? He murmured, his breath warm against my skin. Did you plan on getting 5,000 gold marks? There was no anger in his voice. To my utter shock, what I felt from him, through the bond that connected us, was a wave of grudging, astonished amusement. I turned my head slightly, my lips almost brushing his ear. I was hoping, I whispered back, my voice laced with a newfound audacious confidence, that my future husband was feeling generous. His grip on my shoulder tightened for a second, and a low, dangerous chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound I had never heard before. It sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with fear. He straightened up and addressed the hall, his voice ringing with authority. The funds will be provided from the king's personal treasury, he announced. A gift. To my Luna. He had called me his Luna. Not his choice, not the girl, but his Luna. And he had backed my play. He had sided with me against his own general. I looked across the room at Serafina. Her beautiful face was a mask of pure, murderous hatred. Lord Valerius looked as if he wanted to strangle me with his bare hands. I had won the battle, but I had also just made two very powerful, very deadly enemies. And as Kaelen's hand remained on my shoulder, a silent statement of possession and, for the first time, partnership, I realized the game had just escalated to a level I might not be prepared for. The king was no longer just my jailer. He was becoming something far more complicated, and that, I realized with a jolt, was infinitely more dangerous. The aftermath of the auction was a subtle but seismic shift in the court's dynamics. The whispers that followed me were no longer just of derision, but of a grudging, fearful respect. I had faced down Lord Valerius and won. More importantly, the king had publicly backed me. I was no longer just a curious oddity. I was a player. Seraphina's hatred, however, intensified from a simmering fire to a raging inferno. Her clique no longer bothered with petty insults. Instead, a campaign of sabotage began. A beautiful gown delivered to my room was found to have been discreetly slashed along the seams, designed to fall apart at an inopportune moment. A message from Elias regarding our library meeting would go missing. Small things, impossible to prove, designed to isolate and unnerve me. But I was no longer the frightened girl who had spilled the wine. With my empathic sense, I could feel the deceit before it sprang its trap. I would feel a spike of malice from a passing servant and later find the loose stitch in the dress. I would sense the smug triumph from one of Seraphina's ladies and know to seek out Elias personally instead of waiting for a message. I was always one step ahead. My relationship with Kaelen grew even more complex. He started to seek my opinion, couching it in dismissive terms, but seeking it nonetheless. He'd toss a border dispute summary onto the breakfast table and say, "Read this. Tell me what nonsense you feel from it." And I'd close my eyes, focus on the words, on the intent of the writer, and tell him what I sensed. The Alpha of the Red Creek Pack is boasting, but he is afraid. His eastern border is weaker than he claims. Or, the trade delegate from the south, he is hiding something. Not malice, sickness, a plague in his territory. My insights, which I passed off as intuition or a woman's feeling, proved correct time and time again. Scouts would confirm the border weakness. Discreet inquiries would uncover the news of a fever sweeping the southern provinces, allowing Kaelen to close the trade routes before it could spread. He never praised me. He never acknowledged the strangeness of my accuracy. But the doubt in his mind was growing. I could feel it. He was a man who dealt in facts, in armies and numbers. My uncanny luck was a variable he couldn't compute, and it fascinated and frustrated him in equal measure. His possessiveness also grew. He insisted I attend all council meetings, seated in a chair just beside his throne. I was to be a silent observer, but her presence was a statement. The old, grizzled alphas on his council hated it. They would pointedly ignore me, addressing only the king. During one such meeting, Lord Valerius was arguing for a preemptive strike against the Stonefur pack, citing new evidence of their treachery. His arguments were loud and passionate. The other council members were nodding in agreement. War seemed imminent. Kaelen sat on his throne, his face like stone, listening. I closed my eyes, focusing on Valerius. His anger was real. His desire for war was real. But the evidence, it felt hollow, fabricated. And beneath his rage, I felt a deep, chilling river of something else. Grief and a burning need for vengeance, not for the pack. Something personal. "He's lying," I whispered. So low only Kaelen could hear. His head didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second. "About what?" he murmured back. "The evidence is false, but his hatred for the Stonefurs is real. It's not about livestock or borders. It's personal. Something happened to him. Something involving them." Kaelen was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping a slow, thoughtful rhythm on the arm of his throne. "Lord Valerius," he said, his voice cutting through the general's tirade. "Your passion is noted, but your counsel is clouded. The crown will not be drawn into a war based on your personal vendetta." Valerius froze, his face paling. "My personal vendetta? I do not know what you mean, Your Majesty. I speak only for the good of the pack." "Do you?" Kaelen's voice was dangerously soft. "Then Perhaps you can explain to the council why my sources tell me your youngest son was killed in a drunken brawl in a Stoneford tavern 2 years ago. A fact you failed to mention when you began this campaign for war." A shocked silence filled the council chamber. Valerius looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. He had been exposed, his motivations laid bare for all to see. Kaelen dismissed him with a wave of his hand. The vote for war was dead. Later that night he came to my chambers. It was the first time he had entered my room since that first night. I was by the window, the moonstone cool in my hand, trying to calm my racing heart. The confrontation in the council had been draining. "How did you know?" he demanded, his voice devoid of any preamble. He closed the door behind him, enclosing us in the small space. "Not about the son. About the lie. You knew he was lying before I even presented the proof." I turned to face him, my heart hammering. This was it. The moment of truth. I could lie again, talk about intuition, but I was tired of lying, and I could feel from him that he wouldn't accept another evasion. I held up the moonstone. In the dim light, the soft silver glow at its core was visible. "I felt it," I said simply. "I feel the truth. I am an empath." He stared at the stone, then at my face. He didn't look shocked or disbelieving. He looked as if a piece of a puzzle he had been struggling with for months had just clicked into place. "All this time," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Your intuition, your logic." He took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "This is the real reason you defied me. It wasn't boldness. It was that you could feel that I wouldn't truly hurt you." "I was still terrified," I said honestly. "Feeling your anger is not a pleasant experience, but yes, underneath it, I knew you were more curious than furious." He reached out and took my hand, the one holding the stone. His fingers closed around mine, his skin warm against the cool surface of the gem. The contact sent a jolt through the bond between us, and for a moment, the walls between our minds felt paper thin. I felt the full force of his loneliness, a vast, aching void left by the death of his parents and the crushing weight of the crown. I felt his deep-seated frustration with the sycophants and liars that surrounded him. And underneath it all, I felt his obsession with me, a confusing tangle of possession, fascination, and a burgeoning, reluctant respect that was slowly, terrifyingly starting to feel like something more. He, in turn, felt my own truth. The years of quiet desperation, the burning desire for freedom, the fear and anger I felt toward him, but also the grudging understanding that had begun to grow. He felt my loneliness, a mirror of his own. He let go abruptly, snatching his hand back as if burned. The connection snapped shut, leaving us both breathless. He looked at me with new eyes, a dawning horror and wonder in their gray depths. "The bond," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's not just a claim. With you, it's a conduit." "Yes," I whispered. He looked utterly undone. This powerful, untouchable king who ruled with iron control had just discovered that his innermost feelings were an open book to the woman he'd taken as a prisoner. The tables had turned in the most absolute way imaginable. Before either of us could say another word, a frantic pounding echoed from the main door of his chambers. Your Majesty, you must come at once," a guard's panicked voice yelled. Kaelen's head snapped up, his mask of command slamming back into place. He strode to the door and threw it open. "What is it?" "It's the Eastern Granary, Alpha. It's on fire. The whole thing is going up in flames." Kaelen stiffened. The eastern granary held most of the winter stores for the city. Its loss would be catastrophic. "Sabotage," he snarled. But as the guard spoke, I had felt it. A wave of triumphant, venomous malice, so sharp and clear it cut through the chaos. It was coming from the direction of the fire. And it was unmistakably Seraphina's. This was her move, her revenge for her father's humiliation. But there was something else, tangled with her triumph. A thread of cold, calculated intent that wasn't hers. It was colder, more reptilian. It was her father, Lord Valerius. This wasn't just arson, this was treason. And then a new, horrifying feeling bloomed in the center of that malicious glee. A spike of murderous intent, directed not at the granary but right here, at the king's chambers, at me. "It's a diversion," I gasped, my eyes wide with horror. "Kaelen, it's a trap." As the words left my mouth, the window of my own chamber adjoining his shattered inward. A dark shape, clad in black, vaulted into the room, a long, gleaming dagger in his hand. An assassin. Kaelen reacted with preternatural speed. He shoved me behind him, a low, savage growl ripping from his chest as his own wolf rose to the surface. "Guards," he roared. But the assassin wasn't aiming for the king. His eyes were fixed on me. He lunged, moving with a deadly grace. This was their plan. Valerius and Seraphina. Burn the granary to create chaos and draw Kaelen away. Send an assassin to eliminate me. And in the ensuing panic and starvation of the winter, with the king's chosen Luna murdered and his authority weakened, Valerius would make his move for the throne. Kaelen met the assassin's charge, his movements a blur of controlled violence. But a second figure was climbing through the broken window, and a third. They were all alphas, their faces hidden, their intent a palpable wave of killing lust. The guards in the hall were scrambling, fighting to get through the door, but they were being held back by more assassins. We were cut off. Kaelen was a whirlwind of fury, but he was outnumbered. One of the assassins broke past his guard, his dagger raised, his eyes locked on my throat. There was no time to think, no time for fear. Elias's words echoed in my mind. Power is always real. It simply sleeps until it is called. I raised my hands, the moonstone on its chain falling free. I closed my eyes and didn't just reach for the assassin's emotions. I grabbed them. I poured every ounce of my own terror, my rage, my desperation down the channel of my empathic gift and slammed it into his mind. No. It wasn't a word. It was a psychic scream, a raw, concentrated blast of pure emotion. The assassin screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. He staggered back, dropping his dagger and clutching his head as if his skull were about to split open. He was experiencing not just my fear, but the echo of every terrified emotion I had ever felt, all at once. The other assassins faltered, their attention diverted by their comrade's sudden collapse. The shift was all Kaelen needed. He moved with brutal efficiency, disarming one, breaking the arm of another. The royal guards finally broke through the doorway, swords drawn, and the fight was over in seconds. The chamber was a wreck of overturned furniture and shattered glass. The assassins were subdued, bound and bleeding on the floor. Kaelen stood in the center of it all, breathing heavily, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, primal light. His gaze fell on the assassin I had stopped, who was still curled on the floor, whimpering and incoherent. Then he looked at me. I was shaking, the adrenaline and the effort of what I'd done, leaving me weak and dizzy. My hand was still outstretched, my mind still reeling from the violent contact. Kaelen crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't check me for injuries. He didn't offer comfort. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks, his gaze searching mine with a